the virtual earthworm dissection. Now, it's sad that we're not able to do the dissections, and the earthworm's a good one to start with. For one thing, it's a very simple dissection. You wouldn't think you could see much from an earthworm, but you actually can. So let's go ahead and get started on that. Okay. So, a couple of things you notice when you first see an earthworm, and if you've ever gone fishing or just found a worm in your yard, I know that doesn't happen as often here as it does in the rest of the country because it's so dry. But if you have a well-watered lawn, you might find earthworms there. You can, first of all, you first look at a worm, you can't really tell there's anything to notice about it, but the first thing you can see is the clitellum, this little white band. This is a reproductive structure. It produces a slime tube and it accepts the sperm from the other worm. Worms are hermaphrodites, by the way. They're both male and female. So when they breed, they're exchanging sperm with each other. And the eggs are produced here and they make a cocoon for the eggs. It's not a cocoon like with caterpillars, but it's left in the soil and then the eggs hatch. The front, the anterior, in good scientific terminology, is closer to the clitellum. The posterior, or the back end, is the greater distance from the clitellum. The mouth, of course, is at the anterior, anus is at the posterior. They are deposit feeders. They basically eat dirt, and they take in the nutrients that are in the dirt. They're really good for the soil. They help break things down. They'll also eat little pieces of vegetation and with the dirt, and they help decompose it. And when they poop something called worm castings, little tiny pellets that, hold on just a second. Okay, so can everybody hear me? I got someone saying they weren't able to hear me. I don't seem to be on mute anymore. Let's see. Okay, all right, great. Okay, so anyway, they're very good for the soil. They help by burrowing through the soil. They make space, they get it less compacted. They help decompose things and make the soil more fertile. They're just really good for the soil. Now I have some live ones that I will be showing you day after tomorrow that I've bought for the classroom. I've actually set up worm cultures, and it's for helping to break, it's called vermicomposting. You take the worms, put them in some soil in a box, and then you can put your table scraps in there and they'll break it down and turn it into soil. So I've got 2 boxes of those going, and I'm going to bring one of the live worms into onto my desk with, I was going to say into the classroom, but onto my desk, and I'll be able to show you how they move and everything. So anyway, not only do they have a front and a back when you know what to look for, they also have a top and a bottom. The dorsal side is what we call the top. It's darker. The ventral side is lighter, and when you feel them, you can feel the bristles. They have little tiny hairs you can't really see, but they're there and they help them to grip the soil. You also see the segments. The earthworms are from the phylum of segmented worms, which we will we'll talk about on Thursday as well. Probably, we might not get to them by Thursday. Okay, so if we were doing the actual dissection, you would pin it from both sides and with the ventral surface down, and then you would cut open from starting at one end, you would cut across, and you try not to go too deep, or you would cut through the intestines and you'd be able to see the dirt. You should have seen this actually done on the video. When we get to, if we ever get to do dissections this year, and I'm hoping we will, make sure you cut away from yourself. That's the main safety rule. So as you cut it open, you'll spread it apart and pin it so it'll stay open. You'll do that for the length of the worm. And here you can see if you cut too deep, you can actually see the dirt in the intestines. Okay, so the more interesting stuff is at the anterior end, the front. At the rest of the body, basically all you're seeing are the intestines. But when you get up to the front, you can start to see some different body parts. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the circulatory system. You can see a line going down on top of the intestines, and this is the dorsal blood vessel, and it's darker in color. Here you have what they call aortic arches. Some books call them hearts, but they don't really pump blood. They just pass the blood from the top to the bottom. They have a blood vessel on each side. They also help maintain pressure, and there's several of them right here. Earthworms have a closed circulatory system, and what that means is the blood is enclosed in arteries and veins, just like us. Most invertebrates have an open circulatory system where the blood just kind of sloshes around and bathes all the organs. There's a heart that keeps a current where it moves the blood from the front to the back and things like that, but there's not any arteries and veins like we have and like the earthworms have. So earthworms have a closed circulatory system. The reproductive system. Like I said, they're hermaphrodites. So they're both male and female at the same time. What you'll see here, the most obvious parts of the reproductive system, this is the seminal vesicles, which is where they store their own sperm before they get to reproduce. Now here are the seminal receptacles. This is where they store the sperm from the other worm. When they breed, these are filled up with the other worm's sperm. So make sure you remember those differences. These terms, this dissection will actually be on the test. There will be questions where you have to identify the parts of the worm, okay? So seminal vesicles, seminal receptacles. They do have both ovaries and testes, the male and female gonads. They're very difficult to see in a worm dissection, so we're not going to point them out. And again, a little closer up, here are the seminal vesicles. Again, that stores their own sperm. The receptacles, it stores the other worm's sperm until they're ready to lay their eggs. Okay, the nervous system. It's going to be buried underneath the intestine. So to see the nervous system, you have to scrape away the intestine. So they'll do that for us here. And under the intestine, you'll see the ventral nerve cord. This is basically the worm's spinal cord if they had a spine, which they don't. They're invertebrates, they don't have a backbone. So, but they do have a nerve cord running the length, and there's little branches going off for each segment where the nerves control the muscles and everything else on each segment. Okay, the digestive system. So there's a mouth, of course. Anything that eats has to have a mouth. The pharynx is the first space of the digestive system after the mouth. They swallow the food, the soil, and it connects the mouth to the esophagus, which is the next part. It is underneath the aortic arches. So if you remove the aortic arches, that part is the esophagus. And it moves the food through muscle contractions to the next part, which is the crop. And here you can see it right there when you remove the aortic arches. Okay, the crop is analogous to our stomach. It's thin-walled. It's basically just holding the stuff until it can get passed on to the next part, which is the gizzard. You may have heard of this. Birds have them, chickens have them. You can eat chicken gizzards. They're very muscular, a little tough for my taste, but they can be eaten. And this is thick-walled and full of muscles, and it's used to grind the food. Birds and worms both eat gravel or sand. On worms' case, gravel would be too big, and they store that in the gizzard, and they use muscular contractions to grind the food, break it down into smaller pieces. We don't have a gizzard, but birds do. And the rest of the body, basically everything from here to the tail, or to the anus, is the intestine. It's not coiled like ours. They're long and thin, so there's not room to coil it, and they don't really need to because it's plenty long without that. And this is where the food digestion and nutrient absorption takes place. And that's it for the worm dissection. So you have a lab that you're responsible for doing by Thursday. There's a PDF file for you to download, complete, and then upload. This should not be that. Okay, so let's start talking about worms in general. So think of as many examples of worms that you can. There's lots of different kinds of worms. You hear about earthworms, of course. You're familiar with those. You see them on the sidewalk sometimes after it rains. But there's also the worms that your dogs get or your cats get. Tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms. And if you have a pet, you have to take them to the vet to get them wormed, to kill those worms. Lots of different kinds of worms. Several different phyla of worms, more than one phylum. And we're going to go through those. So here's some examples. These are marine worms, saltwater worms. This one is a polychaete, has lots of bristles. Actually, these are all polychaetes. This is a tube worm. They make a tube that they hide in, and they have these little feathery things they stick out to capture food. Some of them make hard tubes like this. So the first phylum we're going to talk about is phylum Platyhelminthes. The best way to remember this is plat means flat, and it sounds like flat. So Platyhelminthes are the flatworms. Planaria is an example. And this is a marine flatworm. There was one in one of the scenes of Finding Nemo. The flatworms, Platyhelminthes, have bilateral symmetry, just like we do. We're pretty much done with the things that have radial symmetry. Everything else from now on is going to have bilateral symmetry. So they have a left and a right side that are the same, basically. They have a one-opening gut, unlike the earthworm. The earthworm had a mouth and an anus. The flatworms are like the cnidarians, the jellyfish. They have one opening for both the mouth and the anus. Okay. They're hermaphrodites, both male and female. They can reproduce asexually through fragmentation. That basically just means if you cut it in half, you get two worms and they'll regenerate into two separate worms. Or they can do sexual reproduction through an exchange of sperm. I'll show you in a second. Some of them actually fight over who has to be the female. It's kind of weird. They would prefer to not accept the sperm because if they do, they have to develop the eggs. And eggs are nutritionally expensive. It takes a lot of energy to grow eggs. Sperm is cheap, eggs are not. So they much prefer to be the sperm donor and not the sperm acceptor. This is a tapeworm. Tapeworms can be really long, and we'll talk about those on Thursday or Friday. So here's what I was talking about. If it'll start.
Flatworms have both male and female sex organs. But when it comes time to make little flatworms, they have to decide who plays which role. And that they fight over. The two flatworms rear up, exposing their midsections. Those jutting white nibs aren't weapons, at least not intentional ones. They are actually the worm's penises, a double-barreled inseminator, if they can shoot first. Flatworm sex consists of the two attempting to stab their lover with their pointed pair and inseminate each other, an act delicately referred to as penis fencing. But there's nothing delicate about it. Flatworms have been known to gouge holes in each other in battles lasting up to an hour. Why do they cross swords? Producing offspring requires a lot of energy. The winning father can go out and about in the world without any further responsibility. The losing mother absorbs the winner's sperm. It must now work longer and harder to find food and stay alive. The father floats merrily along. The mother crawls along looking for a meal, already the responsible one.
So and there's no vagina. It's kind of weird talking about, but they actually just stab each other and somewhere, and the sperm is absorbed into the body. So here's a typical flatworm, a free-living flatworm. The parasitic ones look different. This is a planarian. Platyhelminthes can be free-living or parasitic. There's free-living ones. There's probably more parasitic ones than free-living ones, though. Cephalization of sensory organs. Basically, all this means is they have a head. You can actually look at this worm and see its head, and that's where the eye spots are, and that's where its nerve clusters that work as a brain are. Sorry about the meowing. And they have no body cavity. Your organs are floating around in an open space in your body. Flatworms are solid. You can see the digestive system is a gap in that solid body, and it basically runs over their whole body. And the really weird thing is the muscular pharynx mid-body. Their mouth is not at their head. It's in the middle of the. So they catch their food, and some of them, this is like a syringe. It's sharp and strong, and they can stab things with it, inject enzymes into it to digest it outside of their body, and then drink the liquefied prey. So you can see the stomach actually stretches towards the front and towards the back. And there's all these branches to help digest food and get it to where it needs to go. Like I said, the ganglia is basically the brain. It's not really a brain, but there's more nerves there, and that does control the body. So the planarian is a freshwater or terrestrial worm, flatworm. There's about 200 species in North America. They're really good at regenerating. So, excuse me a second. If you cut their head in half, they'll actually grow two heads. If you cut the whole worm in half, you'll have two worms. If you cut it in half this way, you can make several different pieces that will grow into new worms. There are land planarians in the US. You may have seen these if you buy potted plants. They come in, they're not native to the US, but they have come in with the plant trade. You bring in potted plants, and at the nurseries, you'll find these under the pots a lot. And they're predatory. They'll eat snails and earthworms and things like that. I've seen worms like this quite a bit in the United States. I think once or twice in New Mexico. Here is one hunting a snail. This is a tropical species. It's prettier than the ones we have and smaller. Notice when it actually catches it, it doesn't, it grabs it with its head, but then it wraps around it because it's carrying mouth is way back here. Just got a hold of it now, it's wrapped around it. Practical, so it's not wasting all the time. Like I said, they're kind of like spiders. You get the base of the and they're done, and that's really something like this. You can actually see the giant pixel there. And stab the snap and look at the gone. That's it. Okay, so some of the marine flatworms are very pretty. There's one. This is a scene from Finding Nemo. So when they swim, it almost looks like a magic carpet. Very pretty for a worm, right? This is one, and they're very predatory. This one actually comes out of the water to chase a crab. If it will start. All right, let's try that again.
Bloody helmets, look! Sick! They're like my favourite. Oh, look at him!
Chasing go.
Oh, he's two! I will get you! I will get you! Oh, bloody helmets!
Is he like calamari?
He's just doing laps! That's amazing. So being able to froth on it.
He's chasing the crab.
Let's hold the crab.
Oh.
This is incredible.
He's backing.
Oh no, he's gonna get him. Oh, the crab! The crab!
You can't come on. It's
Crab, don't touch him.
Why is he poison?
No, as in like, he'll give his position away.
Got it.
That's incredible. Can't believe we just saw that.
You just mugged him.
Okay, so I'm not putting this on the poll question because it's the only one for today. But Platyhelminthes includes what kind of worms? And of course, it's the flatworms. Okay, so there's a lot of parasitic flatworms, and some of them have very huge impacts on humanity in different parts of the world. And on our cattle and pigs, things like that are domesticated animals. And some of our pets too. Flukes are a really bad one. They're parasites in various animal tissues, and they have a complex life cycle. They actually have more than one host, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. To complete their life cycle, they have to infect more than one different creature. So in this case, the mature flukes live in the blood vessels of the human intestine. They breed there, and they release their eggs into the host feces. This is why good sanitation is so important, because if you have toilets and good sanitation, everything goes to the sewer treatment plant, everything's killed there, cleaned, then the life cycle's over. Nothing else happens. But if the waste gets into the water in any way, and sometimes even flood, they release waste, then the eggs develop in the water into a larva. They swim until they find a snail. They bore into the snail's body, and they reproduce in the snail asexually, and at some point another larva is released, and it swims through the water and can penetrate the skin of a human, bore into them, and work their way to the blood vessels of the intestine to start the whole thing again. Here's one. This one's from a cow, I believe. They're quite large. You wouldn't want that inside of you. So here's another one. This infects cattle, and it's basically the same thing. The eggs are shed from the feces. The larvae hatch, find a snail, and they reproduce in the snail, and then with them, they don't find the cow and bore into them. They have to be eaten. And so they'll climb up the plant and sit on the leaves and wait for a cow to eat them. Some of them go one further, where they're the intermediate hosts. I think the one I'm thinking about is an ant. And this is really weird, but the parasite actually controls the ant's brain. And if there's a cow nearby, it causes the ant to climb up to the top of the grass, bite the grass, and just sit there waiting for the cow to eat it. There's another parasite, I don't remember if it's a flatworm or not, but if there's one that, for it to complete its life cycle, it's in a mouse, and the mouse has to be eaten by a cat. And they found out that mice that are infected with this parasite are no longer afraid of cats, the smell of cats. And so they don't run away when they smell cats, and so they're more likely to get eaten. Very strange things some of these parasites can do. Okay.